This lecture is over listening and speaking and the relationship between listeners and speakers, whether it's in the public speaking situation or it's just in a normal context. Listeners and speakers will rely on one another because for communication to take place, as we discussed when we talked about the communication process, it takes two parties for communication to take place. So you have speakers and you have listeners. Speakers and listeners work to do what's called co-create meaning. So they co-create meaning, meaning it takes more than one person to reach that shared meaning that we talked about. The feedback loop is the continual flow or circular response between the speaker and the listener. If you recall, the communication process looked like a cycle, a big circle, and it goes from sender to receiver, back to sender, around in a circle. Well, that continual flow or circular response between speaker and listener is called the feedback loop. It's every conversation you've ever had with somebody follows the feedback loop. Speakers and listeners both need to learn to adjust to one another during a conversation because not everyone communicates exactly the same way. We have a lot of different minute, tiny things that we have to adjust and some large, more meaningful things to adjust while we're having a conversation or giving a speech to an audience. This is a scary statistic for people like me. You have the question at the very top, why is listening important? Well, good listening skills are important because listening is the most common form of communication. And we need to get good at listening or more effective at it because studies show us that we retain only 50% of what we hear immediately after we hear it. Meaning that by the time I finish this lecture and by the time you turn it off, you'll remember only half of what I said. If all you're doing is just listening to my voice. By this time tomorrow, after 24 hours, you'll remember about 35% of what I said today. And by this time, 2 days from now, you'll only remember about 25%, 1/4 of what I said today. We bottom out at about 20% retention. To put it in a different perspective, that's 1 out of every 5 words. That's all you remember in the long term if you're not doing things to amplify your retention. Two words that get used interchangeably quite often in just normal conversation are hearing and listening. They are two different words. They mean two different things. Hearing is the physiological process of perceiving sound. It's largely reflexive or automatic in nature. So your body, unless it is hampered in some way, your body naturally hears. It's automatic, it's reflective, it's physiological. Listening, on the other hand, is the conscious act of recognizing, understanding, and accurately interpreting messages communicated by others. It's a proactive and discriminating process. So there's a lot of active words there like conscious, recognizing, understanding, interpreting. Those are all things that imply thought and action. Listening is proactive, meaning you have to intend to do it, and then it's a discriminating process, meaning that you apply what you know, you apply certain importance to one thing or another over other things. That's what discriminating means in this context. So hearing and listening are very different in nature. Now here's just some food for thought for you. Think about a time when you have been to a movie or sat through a class or listened to the president's State of the Union address or something along those lines. And a friend saw the same movie, sat through the same class, watched the same speech, whatever. You got to talking about it later. Think about that conversation. Did the two of you hear the same speech? Did the two of you get the same assignment in that class, or at least feel like you did? Did you see the same message through the movie? Or were there some differences in your thoughts about those things? I would wager that there were probably some differences. It's like you saw two different movies. You got two different assignments in class. It's like you heard two different speeches. And that is because no two people will process the same information the same way. This is because of the concept selective perception there toward the bottom of the slide. This is the fact that people pay attention to some things more selectively than others. So some messages are more important to us than other messages. And so we tend to ignore those things that are not important to us. Selective perception. So some things that factor into that, we pay attention to what we hold to be important, information that touches on our experiences and backgrounds, and then we sort and filter new information based on what we already know. This is simply the decoding process within the communication process. We sort and filter based on what we already know. So we listen to the message we're receiving, apply what we know about the subject, think it through, process it, and that's how we assimilate knowledge. As a public speaker, we use these principles to discover what's important to your audience, typically through a conversation of some kind ahead of time, or maybe a quick Q&A at the beginning, if it's a completely unfamiliar crowd. We use strategies, once we know what's important to the audience, we use those things to capture and maintain attention with the audience by appealing to their experiences and backgrounds, things that are important to them. When you can, it's always a good thing to associate something within your speech to either individual members or the entirety of your audience. So associate something in your speech with your audience. It's usually a good thing to do. Now we move on to something that's called listening distractions or barriers to active listening. And we're going to cover these on the following slides, but these are just a quick look at some of the different types of distractions that we encounter. Firstly, we have what's called script writing. A script writer is someone who, while they're listening to someone, disengages from the listening process to think about what they would say rather than what the speaker will say next. So sometimes that's where you think about how you're going to reply or how you're going to argue with someone, or maybe they say it and you think, ooh, I wouldn't have said it that way. And so you disengage and you think about how you would have said it rather than how they said it. But either way, your focus is no longer on the speaker. Defensive listeners decide that either they aren't going to like what's being said or that they know better. Generally, this is going to happen whenever you feel like your, as you see here, your attitude, your beliefs, or your opinions are about to be challenged. On some level, you feel like you're about to be offended. And so we decide either not to listen or we start arguing mentally or even sometimes verbally instead of listening to what the other person has to say. Here we have laziness and overconfidence as a barrier to active listening. Laziness occurs when we have the assumption that we already know everything there is to know. I mean, overconfidence plays in right there as well. Sometimes we think the information that's being discussed doesn't apply to us. Oftentimes we are wrong in that assumption. So you need to be very aware of your situation. Otherwise, you might miss out on very important information. Laziness and overconfidence can manifest itself in several ways, whether that's expecting too little from a speaker, you feel like they don't have anything to offer you, so you just don't say anything, or rather, you don't listen to what they have to say. Like I said, it can cause you to ignore important information for you. and it makes you look arrogant. We always want to be perceived by others, to be seen by others as confident people. And sometimes people try to put on that air of confidence by projecting that they don't need any instructions. They don't need to listen to the instructions because they already know how to handle it. More often, that is perceived by others as arrogance instead of confidence. So you want to be careful about that. Then we have what are called cultural barriers to active listening. And this is simply because sometimes there are things across cultures, differences in language or in dialects, which is how we use language, how we use the same language, where there's accents that make it difficult for us to perceive the sounds correctly. There's nonverbal cues that will be different from one culture to another. You see a few examples toward the bottom of the slide. There's word choices that may differ across regions or across countries, even countries that use the same language. And physical appearance may even cause a listening distraction for us. If someone's not dressed the way we expect them to be in that situation, or their hygiene isn't the way that we expect it to be, or whatever the case may be, their physical appearance can cause a distraction. Nonverbals across cultures are very different. You need to be careful what you do with your hands in front of an international crowd. You need to be careful in some cases even what you do with your eyes. And there's many other things that you could look up and as far as differences across cultures with nonverbal communication. So if you want to get better at listening or be a more effective listener, we're going to go through some ideas of things that you can do to help yourself out. First of all, you could set listening goals for yourself. What do I want to get out of this? What do I want to listen for specifically? If you know the topic that's being discussed, sometimes that can be easier. But if you have no idea, then what are some basic goals for yourself? What do you want to take away from this particular lecture or whatever it is? If you are a scriptwriter or a defensive listener, wait until the speakers finish talking before you form your arguments. That can be very difficult, so your focus may need to be on just listening to what they say before I decide what to say back. If you are going to have the opportunity to rebut or to reply, then you want to make sure that you have all of the information, that you didn't disengage from the listening process and start arguing mentally ahead of time. Something else that you can listen for is just the speaker's organizational pattern. We have not discussed those in this class yet, but that will come in one of the following lectures. But suffice it to say for now, organizational patterns have to do with the structure of the speech, whether it's set up in a timeline or according to physical arrangement of what's being described or several other things. So it has to do with how the information is presented. In general, we have any good speech is going to have three main parts: the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. And these are all separated, these different parts, by transitional phrases. So if you can just listen for those transitions between points, those intros, those conclusions, sometimes that helps you stay engaged. Some of you may be gifted note takers, and that may help you pay attention for a longer period of time. Another thing you can look for is nonverbal cues. Things like eye contact. More direct eye contact from a speaker typically implies that the point they're making is a very important one. So if you see a speaker who suddenly steps away from their notes, either literally or figuratively, where they maybe just look up and make more prolonged eye contact with the audience, chances are that's a very important point for you to take note of. A few other things concerning nonverbal cues. A cue, by the way, is simply an indicator of something. So a nonverbal indicator. You look at body language, which is a good source of information. You look at stance and posture. If someone is very rigid or stiff, that may imply that they're nervous, or they're strict, or they are even passionate about the subject they're talking about. It could imply several different things, so you want to try to figure out what their stance, what their posture might indicate. You have facial expressions, of course, that you can look at. They provide cues and clues that help you listen better. You can see all the different examples there of facial expression. The most important thing on this slide is this very last bullet point. If a verbal and a nonverbal message do not correspond, the nonverbal cues are typically more trustworthy. If a verbal and a nonverbal message contradict one another, typically we can find truth in the nonverbal message. Nonverbals are harder to mask and harder to deceive with. So nonverbal messages are oftentimes more trustworthy than verbal messages. Another very important skill that you can develop, and you should continue to develop throughout your life, is critical thinking skills. Critical thinking is simply the ability to evaluate claims on the basis of well-supported reasons. You can't do it without effective listening skills, without well-developed listening skills. With critical thinking, we can evaluate evidence. We can analyze assumptions and biases from a speaker's point of view and from our own point of view. We can assess an argument's logic. Does everything add up? Does it make sense? We can resist false assumptions, overgeneralizations, and other fallacies of reasoning, which we will get into those when we get into persuasion later in the semester. Critical thinking can help us consider multiple perspectives, to step outside of our own perspective and look at it through someone else's eyes. Critical thinking can also help us summarize and judge a presentation as a whole. We have a tendency sometimes to get distracted and honed in on just small details instead of looking at the big picture. Critical thinking skills can help us step outside of our tendency to do that. You will oftentimes, whether it's in the workplace or it's in a class or wherever else, you will be in a position at some point where you need to evaluate what someone else is saying, whether it's a formal evaluation that you're filling out or it's a mental evaluation to decide whether or not you trust what someone's telling you. The trick is to be as objective as possible. Focusing on one thing or another, like we were just talking about, something that you really like or something that you really dislike, can make you place an undue importance on that, and thus results in a less than fair evaluation of the information being presented to you. Another big thing for us to work on is remaining open to listening to ideas and beliefs that differ from your own. That's difficult to do. Again, with those critical thinking skills, it helps to be able to step outside of ourselves and become more objective instead of subjective. But remaining open to ideas and beliefs that differ from your own is something that we should all work on. Another thing to remember about evaluating others is to be compassionate in that criticism. We don't like the word criticize, but to criticize is simply to offer instructions for improvement. So an evaluation is simply a criticism. This is another way to say it. But we want to be compassionate in that criticism. So you want to critically evaluate a presentation in a manner that is constructive rather than cruel. So sometimes that's as simple as starting by saying something positive. Focus on the message that has been delivered. Don't criticize the person themselves. target your criticism. In other words, you want to be specific on things that need improvement. You can also report on things that have been done well and target your criticisms or your praises, rather, in that direction. Sometimes if it's speeches that you are criticizing or critiquing, it's the way someone presents material may not be in a style that is your preference. So you need to learn to adjust your listening style to a speaker style at times. There may be nothing wrong with the way they presented it. It just might not be the way you would have presented it. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. Listening is a skill that we all need to continue to develop and continue to work on, getting better at. So put your mind to that and continue to work on that skill.